Now we'll examine how to undo in Photoshop and what is the history panel. Undoing in Photoshop is not as simple as in some other programs. I make different actions so I can test the undo. Photoshop uses the same command for undo as other programs. Ctrl Z. If I press Ctrl Z, it will undo my last action. If I press Ctrl Z again, my brushstroke appears again. So, in Photoshop, Ctrl Z is undo and redo. Photoshop does remember more than this one action. It even has its own panel for this memory, the History panel. You can find it from the right-hand side if you're on the Essentials view, or then you can select it from Window History. I drag the panel to be taller. By default, the History panel should show the last 50 actions. I can go back in history by clicking on a previous state. My list has the brushstrokes, hue saturation changes, the smudge tool, and the first brushstrokes. The topmost part is the last saved state. I'll go back to the present by clicking on the bottommost state from the History panel. So I can move backwards in history in the History panel. If I go back to a previous state and I perform one action, the future is lost. The history doesn't become tree-shaped. It is linear. Now that I've performed only one action in history, I can still go back to present by clicking Ctrl Z. This reveals the actions to the history list. So now I can click myself back to present. If I go backwards in history and perform two actions, I cannot bring back the future. You don't need to open the History panel to go back in time. You can go backwards multiple steps by clicking on Ctrl-Alt-Z. You can keep the Ctrl and Alt pressed and only click on Z. Forwards in history, I can go by pressing Ctrl-Shift-Z. You should always collapse the History panel when it's not in use. Otherwise, you'll get into big trouble. You don't even need to open it if you just remember the commands. Ctrl-Z for undo, redo. Ctrl-Alt-Z for going backwards in history. This is how you undo in Photoshop.